everyone. Welcome to the January 31st edition of the TimeformUS Pacecast. I'm David Aragona, and this week we are taking a look back at the first major weekend in racing of 2023. That, of course, is Pegasus World Cup weekend. It's kind of become the first real major racing weekend after the Breeders' Cup the prior year, and it's kind of a crossroads weekend in racing with some stars departing. I know there were some headlines about Cyberknife, this being his last race after he competed in the Pegasus World Cup. He, of course, was the beaten favorite in that race, and we'll see what the connections of some other horses that competed on that card decide to do, whether they're off to the breeding shed or proceeding on to a 2023 campaign. But it's also a weekend where we typically see some stars emerge, and I think that was the case at Gulfstream on Saturday in a few races, and also out at Oaklawn Park, where we saw probably the leader of Bob Baffert's brigade of three-year-olds emerge, as Arabian Knight was the impressive winner of the Southwest. We'll talk about him a little bit, and some other racetracks as well, some noteworthy performances from the weekend. We will be recapping stakes from Gulfstream, Oaklawn, Aqueduct, and Santa Anita on this show. And you might have seen on Twitter, my usual co-host Craig Mulkowski did put a note out. He's not going to be doing the podcast this week, had something come up which will force him to kind of be on double duty with Speed Figures this week, so he's just not going to be available to do these recordings with me. But I will have two guests on the podcast this week, and today I'm happy to welcome on Sara Elbadwi to help me recap this past week in racing. You might know Sara from Twitter or her prior work at Horse Racing Nation, where she did a bunch of videos that you could see with Ed DeRosa or some race analysis on her own. And Sara just brings a fresh perspective to the sport, and I know she has some exciting things on the horizon, so I wanted to have her on to talk about what's going on in racing. So Sara, welcome to the podcast.
I appreciate you having me on. Some very big shoes to fill with Craig being out for this week, but I'm very excited to be here, and I appreciate the opportunity to talk about a crazy weekend of races with you where, just like you said, we saw a lot going on, a lot of implications for the start of the year.
Yeah, definitely. Much to recap from this past weekend. It hasn't really been the case for the weeks prior to this. There's typically a real lull in the racing calendar leading up to the Pegasus World Cup, but it just feels like things start really picking up this weekend, and it's going to stay that way, kind of that fevered pitch throughout the rest of the Derby prep season. So we'll start talking about some of those in just a little bit. But before we get to that, I just wanted to talk to Sara a little bit about her background. Just tell us a little bit about how you got into racing, because, as a fellow young person, although you're much younger than I am, I know that, unless you have a real connection to racing, it's not the most obvious career path. So just talk a little bit about your background and how you got into working in racing.
Oh, come on, I'm not that much younger than you, but I know that we're all on the hunt for some young perspectives in racing. Certainly when anybody new seems to join in, we all want to know, where did you come from and how can we make you stay? But I had a family friend growing up that was into racing and into gambling as well. And so that was kind of my exposure to racing to begin with. And I was always into horses. I took lessons as a kid. I ended up getting my bachelor's in equine studies. So that mixture of trying to solve the ever indecipherable puzzle and getting into trying to figure out what's going to happen in these races, and just always being a fan of the horses has kind of stuck with me forever. And I've recently been able to turn this hobby into a growing career for myself, which has brought me to meet people just like you and others in the industry. So it's been quite the wild ride for the past year or so, and it only continues to go all these kinds of crazy places that I never really imagined it would. So I'm just trying to do my best and go along to see wherever this takes me.
That's really awesome. And, a lot of people I talk to, I know that people in their 20s and 30s that do get into this sport, they often have some connection to the backstretch or a racing connection. I mean, I don't want to use the word nepotism, but I mean, you do see a lot of people that kind of get ushered into the sport through family traditions. And it's cool to see somebody that kind of come into it like I did from the handicapping or the betting side, just being a fan of the sport and getting that, door into it. And you obviously have a different background than I do with some of your studies, but I mean, it's cool to see people coming into this from all different directions. And I know that you're kind of in transition now. I know you recently wrapped up your work at HRN. So just kind of talk about what you've got coming up on the horizon.
Yeah, so I recently accepted a position with Naira as a production assistant with them. So it'll be a mix of kind of the types of things that I used to do for HRN, as far as planning content ideas, social media, and then some on-air analysis as well, helping out with some of their videos that they do for Blood Horse, the occasional Talking Horses appearance, and that kind of stuff for them. So I'm really looking forward to joining the team over there. That's kind of always been where I imagined myself going to in the future, and to have it be this near in the future is really exciting, and I'm really looking forward to it.
Yeah, I saw you got initiated on your first Talking Horses appearance. What about like 3 or 4 weeks ago at this point? What was that like for you?
The notes that I took for that were quite extensive and more so than any other racing preparation that I had done before because I really just wanted to make sure that I knew enough about the horses that I liked, the horses that Andy liked as well, the horses that might have a shot or might not at all, and whatever case could be made for or against them. So I feel like I know more about that card of races than maybe anything else that happened in the past year. But it was exciting. It was a really cool opportunity to be on there, and I look forward to being able to do it again sometime soon.
That's awesome. Definitely look forward to seeing you do more work with Andy and with the rest of the Naira team. So definitely we'll be following Sara for her future endeavors at the New York Racing Association. Well, Sara, let's get into some of this racing. And of course, I think we've got to begin the conversation with that Gulfstream Park card on Saturday and of course the future race there, the Pegasus World Cup. And we saw a bit of an upset here as Art Collector was able to get the job done at 15-1. There were some no-shows in this race. I already mentioned Cyberknife was the beaten favorite in here. He's a horse who definitely had the reputation coming in, but the trip just didn't really seem to work out for him. He was never really in the hunt this day. Not the case for Art Collector, who just got the right kind of trip into the race, always out in the clear, and he really delivered one of his good efforts.
He did. And I mean, he successfully executed a running style that wasn't generally working for him in the past, with laying a little bit off of the pace. He wasn't going to get the lead early on paper, but it didn't really seem to matter. That was the main reason why he wasn't high up on my radar as a top win candidate for this race, just with the way things were looking to set up pace wise on paper. But he made this trip work for him, and he really seemed to be powerfully drawing away towards the wire, and just seemed like he was much the best in there. As many people will then argue afterwards that he seemed that way online. However, he did go off at 15-1 and paid $33 to win. So not everyone was quite as sure of his ability in this race as they might seem afterwards.
Yeah, this was a card that Craig and I had handicapped on our forecast last week. We did this late pick five sequence, and I feel like I personally fell into a little bit of a trap in this race when I was handicapping because I ended up picking Defunded and Cyberknife first and second, and I did feel they were the two most likely winners of the race, but in a wide open field like this, I feel sometimes it's wise to stop yourself from falling into the trap of taking the horses that are so obvious that everybody's going to land on, because 2-1 and 5-2 on these horses in a race that did look this wide open, probably undervalued. And you do have a horse like Art Collector, who I will say this is not a red board at all because I was not a fan of his going in. But 15-1, I understand how, even if you're not the biggest fan of a horse like that, you can't deny that he had back races that would make him real tough in here if, let's say, Cyberknife didn't get the trip or Defunded didn't take that step forward that you were thinking he might. So, I mean, the trip was the real question for Art Collector, but as you said, once he was able to execute that stalking performance, I mean, he just became kind of logical in here and was able to put forth a 107 buy or a 127 TimeformUS speed figure. Those are numbers that he had gotten pretty close to in the past, particularly a couple of years ago when he won the Woodward. So, I mean, it's not like this was maybe as big of a surprise as that 15-1, those 15-1 odds might have suggested, but just not the kind of horse that I was going to have on this day, maybe due to my own mistakes.
I agree with you completely. When you look back and you see that he's 7 for 9 at the distance beforehand going in, his multiple graded stakes victories, the past kind of numbers that he had been able to put up, when you look at the rest of the field outside of horses like Defunded and Cyberknife, you can say, okay, 15-1, that was a little bit too high of a price for him compared to some other contenders in this field and the lower prices that they were. And then when you took one of those top two contenders and the fact that he didn't really show up with Cyberknife, I mean, he makes some sense. I never would have picked him anywhere near the top. I didn't think that he was going to be able to get that kind of trip and run well with it. But this isn't the most illogical result of a race that I've ever seen, although I can't say that he was ever going to be a horse that I bet to win or included in my exotics.
Yeah, it's Sometimes we have a real history with these horses and we see them run so often. You have strong feelings about them that develop over time. And Art Collector, for me, was just always a horse that had gotten perfect trips when he'd been successful and just kind of didn't give him the credit that maybe he deserved for a few of his victories, even considering those perfect trips. Because when a horse does get perfect trip race after race at the similar distances, I mean, sometimes you have to concede that they might be making those circumstances for themselves. So Art Collector was the winner of the Pegasus. We'll just mention a few more horses that finished in behind him. Defunded, I thought, ran his race. Probably ran as well as he had in his prior two efforts out in California. Just wasn't quite good enough. We mentioned Cyberknife didn't really show up. And some big prices in behind those. I mean, if you could have gotten to Stiletto Boy or Last Samurai for the Superfecta, I mean, they definitely increased the prices of those wagers. But I think that just speaks to the fact that this wasn't the strongest Pegasus World Cup that we've seen compared to some recent years.
Right. And Art Collector, he runs good races, but even looking at the rest of this field, can I say that he beat the strongest field ever? No, not really. Like you said, I feel as though Defunded ran his race, and he's a decent horse, and he went to stalk the pace and be close up like we kind of thought that he would right off of Stiletto Boy, who was pretty hard scent. And Stiletto Boy's a cool horse. I mean, he always seems to show up and get a piece of things at huge prices. Last Samurai closed in at another huge price. And when you look at the rest of this field, there were just horses that kind of weren't that good or didn't run the races that they had in the past. So there were a lot of, I want to say, disappointments in here.
For sure. And before we move on from this race, just want to mention it's been quite the past 12 months for trainer Bill Mott. I included him on my Eclipse ballot for champion trainer. I think I voted for him third. Just wanted to give him a mention because he really has won a lot of major races over the past year or so. Doesn't have the numbers of a barn like Chad Brown or Brad Cox or I guess even Steve Asmussen, who was the third finalist for the Eclipse Award. But he's got a lot of good horses in the barn, and it seems like a few of them are coming back into trading for 2023. So it could be another big year for Bill Mott.
Agree completely. It'll be exciting to see what other kind of stock he has this year.
Let's move on to some other graded stakes action from that Gulfstream Saturday card. The other grade one, of course, was the Pegasus World Cup Turf, and kind of a similar situation from a quality standpoint with these two races compared to some prior years. Probably not the greatest edition of the World Cup Turf that we've ever seen, and I think you can kind of tell when you see the winner of this race is a Tone, who, don't get me wrong, he's been a good horse for a few years now, but I don't think anybody mistook him for a grade one quality horse. This was a race where I think trips really mattered in the end, and he got one of the best trips of all.
Absolutely. I mean, he projected to be a player based on his early speed, but then ended up sitting just off of the pace. And the pace was fairly legitimate with horses like One More Bid, King Cause, even Lady Spitespear and Wit being ahead of him early. And then he had a nice kick once he had room. And even Ivar did get started ahead of him, and he just ran him down.
Yeah, I thought Irad Ortiz really adapted well to the fact that it was clear coming out of the starting gate, a lot of other riders sensed the lack of pace in here and decided to go forward, whereas it might have not looked that way on paper. And Irad, as he's so good at doing, just kind of decided to go to plan B and rate this horse off the pace and able to make that run through the stretch. Definitely helped, though, that he was able to save ground on the turns, which is so important at Gulfstream Park. And Irad just has a way of finding that seam at the top of the stretch or finding room for himself, and he was able to do that with the Tone. As usual, another good effort for Ivar. Was able to do it going a mile and an eighth here. He's been a little bit more of a mile specialist in the past, but I mean, he ran up to a similar level here, and you know, we don't see this horse run that often, but when he does show up on the racetrack, he typically puts forth a good effort.
He does. And I mean, he's been very aggressively spotted almost exclusively versus stakes company throughout his entire campaign since coming to the US. He always shows up, but he doesn't usually come through with the win, even though he has been this ultra consistent type. So, I mean, he's one that you have to respect, but he was one that I was always trying to beat in this race. Unfortunately, not with the eventual winner.
Yeah, and it just turned out that a Tone, whether you liked him or not, he was not much of a price in this race, actually vying for favoritism at 7-2. I mean, the 12-1 morning line probably was always a little bit high on this horse. I mean, not that I would envy anybody making a morning line in such a wide open race like this, but he did seem to have a lot of arrows pointing to him here. But not sure that people who were backing him off that 12-1 morning line thought that the 960 payout was real value on a Tone, but of course he did did get the job done. So I guess a winner is a winner. There were certainly some trips in this race. I don't want to focus too much on them because a lot of the horses that did have poor trips finished far back. I will say City Man never had a chance. I know he crossed the wire in last place, but I mean, that was just not the journey that I think Christophe Clement was hoping for.
I know this is a horse that you have been quite fond of, and I know that you were cringing during this race, seeing what kind of difficulties he had to deal with, and I am sure that he will run much better next time than what we saw from him in here.
Yeah, I mean, Joel Rosario's just been struggling a little bit, I know, recently in the past month or so at Gulfstream Park. And not that he had too many options breaking from the 12 hole. They were kind of just given the short end of the stick at the post position draw, but he really did go about 5 wide around the turns. And you can't do that at Gulfstream Park and expect to be effective on the turf. Did see some other nice performances in stakes action a little bit earlier in the day at Gulfstream. The Pegasus World Cup Filly and Mare Turf, just an odd name for a race that is a grade 3 event, but whatever. I mean, it featured a pretty nice field and a horse in Queen Goddess that I think could eventually turn into a grade 1 type of filly, because she had hinted when she came back in her return, I think it was the Robert J. Frankel at Santa Anita in her prior race, that she might have taken a real step forward since returning from the layoff, and I think she confirmed that here, which what I thought was a pretty commanding victory.
I would agree, and the pace in here didn't quite play out exactly how I imagined, because Sweet Enough ended up going right to the lead, who was one that I thought would sit just off of Delika and Queen Goddess. And then Queen Goddess was able to stalk those two just to the outside of them, and even Artie's Princess as well. The top two threw in the towel. Sweet Enough backing up certainly didn't do Waka Naka any favors, and Queen Goddess always seemed to be very comfortably holding off the two that did close from the back in Shantasara and Lady Rocket. Her only bad races were really the QE2 over yielding turf at Keeneland and the Bayakoa on dirt at Oaklawn. So, I mean, you had to respect, even if you weren't totally sold on some of that California turf form, that she was running very consistent races and was one that was going to be close enough early.
Yeah, I mean, if you follow this podcast, you know that I'm never looking to endorse these California horses that are shipping east, but there was something about her last race that just really suggested that she was so much better than those runners that she was facing out there. And I think the concern was that she was going to be able to do it going the mile and a 16th distance. But as you said, the pace of this race turned out to be pretty demanding. And I think her stamina really kicked in towards the end because she was able to put away those other speeds and still hold off the late runners. So a really nice effort from Queen Goddess. And I think one of the things that's most exciting about her is that she's got such versatility with regard to distance. I mean, she was narrowly beaten in a stakes going a mile and a half back in early May of 2022. She was a specialist going a mile and a quarter for her 3-year-old season. So definitely seems like one that can go farther than this. In the form that she's in, I think the connections will have a lot of options with her. Nice to see Shantasara get back into form. She was such a good 3-year-old filly. I know that she's had a lot of setbacks over the past year or so, but seemed like she took a step in the right direction here. And she's another that's probably going to want to go some longer distances in the future.
Right. She did at least run in this race, and she ran well, which was much better than we had seen from her in her last race, as well as the one before that. And she, I think, kind of answered those questions that she is going to be in better form that we had seen in the past, and is one to look forward to in the future.
And I should mention, this race, Craig did put out the speed figures last night. This one got a 125 TimeformUS speed figure, a 100 buyer. It's actually a higher TimeformUS number than what Atone got for winning the Pegasus World Cup turf, that he got a 124. Buyer was a little higher on the World Cup turf. Atone got a 103 from that team. So some pretty nice speed figures of both of these graded stakes turf races at Gulfstream on Saturday. Some other graded stakes event that took place a little bit earlier in the day, the Fred W. Hooper, that grade 3 on the dirt going a mile, was won by Endorsed, and not the strongest grade 3 field that you're ever going to see, although it was a pretty competitive race, and Endorsed has really figured things out for Mike Maker recently, Sarah. I mean, he was a horse that just could not find the winner's circle for a few seasons. I think he had something like nearly 20 losses in a row, but now he's won 2 in a row, so it seems like Mike Maker's got him going on a good run right now.
Yeah, I mean, his last two races prior to the Fred Hooper really made him a player in here. I think you can toss that turf race as well as the mile and the 16th start at Mountaineer, where there was just really no pace on. And it seemed like he was going to have some pace to chase in this spot. The other horses that seemed like logical players on paper in here didn't really show up. Miles D hadn't been seen in almost a year. Seemed like he would prefer more distance than the mile, but I mean, Chad Brown does well with layoffs like this, and he had been successful versus very tough company in the past. So with him and Black Belt not really firing in this race, Endorsed was the only logical player, at least on paper, that did show up and was able to get up in time.
Yeah, I thought he made a lot of sense coming in here. Just seemed like he was coming in good form. And there were obviously questions about the others, as you noted. And Miles D, I think at the end of the day, it just turned out this was maybe the wrong spot for him. He's kind of a grinder, or with not a lot of early speed, and he just got too far outrun in the early stages of this race. And you can't let that happen at Gulfstream Park and still expect to be successful. Just with the kickback there, especially in a large field like this, that was a difficult go of it for Miles D. We'll see if they have a bit more success stretching him back out to the two turns in the future. But Endorsed, good performance. The speed figure, I think, was a 96 buyer, a 119 TimeformUS speed figure. So really good for him, but I think he's going to have to do a little bit better if he expects to be competitive in some of the top races in this mile division moving forward. And Sarah, it was a real big day for Mike Maker. I mean, he had success in many of these graded stakes races, and I think the exclamation point was in the William L. McKnight, where he actually sent out the trifecta as Red Knight was able to beat two of his stablemates. And Red Knight is just such a cool horse. I mean, a 9-year-old. I think I was saying on the TimeformUS forecast last week, he's a 9-year-old who seems like he's had 9 lives because he just goes out of form and just keeps somehow coming back. And it seems even better than ever now at this age of nearly 10 years old, and put forth one of his good efforts to win this Grade 3 on Saturday.
Yeah, I mean, he got a great trip as well. I think there were some very valid concerns going into this race about the favorite Aban's form since his win in last year's event. And there was also a lot more pace pressure this year than he had to face last year. Red Knight was last early off a very lively pace. He got a great ride. He followed the move of a fellow maker trainee, Value Engineering, got into the clear and made his run where those pace setters were dissolving in there. And the figure that he got for this, a 95 buyer, really seems well within his wheelhouse. He's run hundreds in the past. He got a 97 for his Grade 2 Turf Cup win at Kentucky Downs. And he just seems to keep showing up, kind of like you said.
Yeah, I mean, he's had some real highlights throughout his career. I mean, he was a good horse for Bill Mott for many years. It kind of gone off form for that barn, but seems like he's now, found a new lease on life since the trainer switched to Mike Maker at the beginning of 2022. And, his Breeders' Cup obviously was not one of his better, one of his shining moments, but I mean, that was always going to be a tough spot for him, and he got a ridiculous trip in that race. So, I mean, he was able to get back in form here. What you said about the pace was totally true. They were really going, some enterprising fractions on the front end. If you look in TimeformUS, all of the pace figures for this race are color-coded in red, indicating a fast pace. So that really did help things to fall apart, and that really helped the Mike Maker runners because most of them were the late runners in this field, and they were able to swallow up some of those speeds to run first, second, third, and actually even fifth. He had 4 of the top 5 finishers in this race, as even Temple was 5th here. So big efforts from the Mike Maker barn and Red Knight, just the best horse on the day. A little bit earlier in the day at Gulfstream on Saturday, they ran the Grade 2 Inside Information. This one a sprint for the fillies and mares, and another beaten favorite in this race as Obligatory, who was bet down to 4-5, just threw in a real clunker, was never really involved, and a horse that you can trust to come through when that's the case is Mary Quite Contrary, who's been kind of a local wonder horse. I think this was her 6th win in 7 career starts, and her 5th in a row. She's not running the highest speed figures, but she just keeps winning.
She does, and I mean, you could trust that she was going to at least run her race. You knew that she liked to win races, and aside from Obligatory, there wasn't a ton going on in this field. And when Obligatory just really didn't show up at all, I mean, she was the one that made the most sense. She had progressively improving buyer speed figures, even though they weren't the kind of figures that Obligatory had run in the past. But that's one of my favorite things to see. And I mean, a horse like Obligatory, who generally does need a serious pace setup to be her most effective, I didn't really see Mary Quite Contrary out closing her as that's what happened in the race, but she was able to get it done. She was further back early than everybody, and she went right by them all.
Yeah, there actually was some pace in this race, and I will say, I don't want to be too hard on Jose Ortiz, because clearly he didn't have the horse to get it done here. His mount obligatory just didn't run her race, but I thought he made some questionable decisions in the race. I'm not sure why he was riding her so aggressively out of the starting gate to kind of attain a forward position when it did seem like there was the pace in this race for her to close into. And I thought Luca Panici gave the kind of ride that obligatory should have gotten. He just did it on Mary Quite Contrary, just letting her walk out of the gate. She was towards the back early, and she made that outside run around the field, whereas obligatory was trying to, regain her momentum while in between and behind horses. And that's really difficult to do at Gulfstream, especially with the kickback situation that we see there. So Mary Quite Contrary got it done. I'm not viewing her as a grade 1 type just yet, because she only got I think it was a 91 buyer and a 103 Timeform US speed figure. I mean, those are not grade 1 level numbers, but she just keeps winning. So, I mean, she's a horse that you have to respect from that perspective.
For sure. And I mean, I saw exactly what you did with obligatory being ridden for position out of the gate. It was very clear quickly that that tactic was not effective in keeping her within range, if that was in fact the game plan. And even though that was what was asked of her, she just did not want to play along with that idea for this race. And it showed. And she was never going to be effective, but whatever was being tried, it did not work for her.
For sure. And before we move away from that Saturday card at Gulfstream, there were plenty of races that we could talk about that took place earlier in the day as non-stakes event. I do want to mention one of them that was an allowance race that I think was the 5th race on the card, going a mile on the turf, won by the Todd Pletcher trainee Up to the Mark. And just want to mention this race because this horse was making his first ever turf start, and despite the fact that his pedigree wasn't overwhelmingly turfy, he really took to it well and looks like a future stakes horse on this surface.
Every single race where Not Far Now is running, you know that there's going to be some speed. And Up to the Mark was able to really settle near the back of the pack. And once you saw him coming, he looked extremely dangerous. I was focused in on Chasing the Crown, which was the horse that I bet in this race. And when I saw the move Up to the Mark was making, I knew that everybody ahead of him was in serious trouble.
Yeah, you could see around the far turn as soon as he came into the screen, and track announcer Pete Aiello caught the move at that time and basically was just focused on him from that point forward. I mean, there was no stopping him. As long as he didn't find some traffic, he was going to win that race, and he sustained that momentum right through the finish line to win by 4 lengths. And when you win a race by 4 lengths on the turf, that's usually pretty meaningful because typically these races are pretty bunched at the wire, and his closing splits were pretty impressive. He's got a nice pedigree, and he looked like a horse that was going to be a promising dirt miler at first for Todd Pletcher, especially when he debuted last summer in Saratoga, but he had kind of gone off form, and it seems like this switch to the turf has really re-energized him. And boy, these progeny of Not This Time can just do anything, go short or long, win on the dirt or the turf. It doesn't matter. I mean, they're just such versatile animals.
Yes, I mean, he's a stallion who has above average stats with everything. And even though this horse does have a nice pedigree, it's not as though it was a significant major turf move up pedigree. His only win was that maiden race going the 6 furlongs on an off track at Saratoga and wasn't necessarily on my bingo card for the day, but Todd Pletcher has had plenty of success switching surfaces with unlikely pedigrees.
And speaking of the Todd Pletcher barn, we saw them unveil what seems like a pretty talented 3-year-old filly on the Sunday card at Gulfstream. Pretty small field of 3-year-old fillies going 7 furlongs, but there were a couple of first-time starters in there that looked like they might have some talent, and it was Bandita who got the job done, winning pretty impressively by over 8 lengths. And this daughter of Gunrunner seems like one that could have a real future.
She's a horse to get excited about when I don't know that we've seen a ton to be really excited about going into the Oaks and Derby season. She broke beautifully, led the whole way. The only one to make a serious move at her was the other first-time starter, Arrowbolt, and it was clear that that wasn't even that serious of a move, and she was just much the best, even though she did swap back to her inside lead. Irad was able to just keep her going forwards. She changed to the outside lead again before the wire, and there's some a few bright clouds ahead for her, some blue sky ahead for this one.
Totally. I noticed the same thing about her kind of swapping leads at the top of the stretch like that. Just still a little bit of greenness there, some things to learn. But I mean, even at that point in the race, she was really accelerating away from the field. So obviously talented. The one thing I will point out was this race did feature a very slow pace that benefited her. They went nearly 47 to the half mile, which is basically walking at Gulfstream Park. But the way that she accelerated and was able to sprint home, it leads me to believe that she might not be this one-dimensional speedball that needs the lead. I wouldn't be surprised if she's able to rate off another horse, just given the race shape here and the way that she finished off the race. So definitely one to follow moving forward. And actually, I was looking up her pedigree, and she actually is bred along very similar lines to a horse that we're going to talk about a little bit later in this rundown, Gunite. She's by Gunrunner, and actually they're from the exact same female family. I think the second dam on both of them is a horse named Simplify, who has been a pretty good sprinter miler influence. So it's going to be interesting to see how far Bandita wants to go and what the Pletcher barn decides to do with her. Let's move on to Oaklawn Park, where we'll talk about a couple of the 3-year-old stakes that they ran on that Saturday card. Obviously, there was some weather in Hot Springs, Arkansas that forced the track to, I think, initially be labeled as wet fast and then I think later sloppy. So that kind of plays into the results a little bit and maybe makes them a little bit less able to predict form moving forward. But I'm not sure that it really mattered for the winner of the Southwest, Sara, Arabian Knight, who had garnered a lot of hype off of his impressive debut victory at Keeneland on Breeders' Cup weekend and certainly lived up to it once again in another easy 5-length score, looking like he had plenty more in the tank.
I mean, this is the 3-year-old that is asserting himself so far. He controlled the whole race. He rolled coming into the stretch. He answered that off-track question. He really extends his stride very impressively, and it was just never in doubt in this race. He gets a debut buyer going 7 furlongs at Keeneland. That was a 97, so he basically replicated that versus winners and going further on and off track. There are a few more questions like, can he rate? Can he continue to stretch out? And who is he going to do that with if he's aiming for the Derby, as he will have to switch trainers in the near future?
Yeah, that's one of the big questions on the horizon for these Bob Baffert trainees is when will they change trainers? How is that going to play out in court? I know there are some cases around that. We're not going to get into that in a lot of detail right now, but I mean, it's obvious that Bob Baffert has an embarrassment of riches among the 3-year-olds right now. So he's going to have a major impact on the Kentucky Derby Trail with the horses that are currently in his barn. And it does seem like Arabian Knight is really leading that charge at the moment off of these 2 victories. You know, I wouldn't say that this was the toughest field in the world, although I do think that Red Route 1 is a nice horse who has just kind of been grinding his way into the Kentucky Derby picture with these strong finishes. He's a horse that I think you'll probably hear from a little bit more down the line. But Arabian Knight just beat them so easily, and I saw the same thing you did with that massive stride on him. He just kind of floats over the ground, very reminiscent of his sire, Uncle Mo. So we'll see if he wants to go the 1.25 mile distance. I think we'll find that out down the line. I guess the one concerning thing coming out of this race, Sara, was that Bob Baffert was already kind of telegraphing that this horse is not going to run back particularly soon. Makes it sound like maybe there's only going to be one more race between now and the Kentucky Derby. And I guess that's just the way that things are in 2023. You know, once these horses kind of establish themselves, you want to kind of wrap them in bubble wrap and hope that they can stay in good condition until Derby Day. But he'd be going into the Kentucky Derby with a pretty light schedule if he just had 3 races under his belt.
Right, it's a little reminiscent of what we saw happen with Taba going into the Derby this past year, but we hadn't seen this kind of talent yet from Taba, so it's possible that this one gets one more start under the belt, and that's a more educational race as far as learning if he can rate off of other horses or a step up as far as distance. And we haven't even seen him run at Santa Anita yet, which is where most Bafferts do run. So it'll be interesting to see what happens with him, but you can't deny that he's very talented.
Yeah, definitely an exciting horse on the march towards the Triple Crown. And speaking of the 3-year-old picture, we saw another Kentucky Oaks contender emerge for the Brad Cox stable in the Martha Washington, which was run a little bit earlier in the day at Oaklawn Park on Saturday. And Brad Cox, kind of like Baffert with the 3-year-old males, he has many good 3-year-old fillies in his barn. We saw a few of them in action at the fairgrounds, I believe, a couple weeks ago. And here, Wet Paint was able to insert herself into the Oaks picture with this Martha Washington victory. And, you know, Sara, Wet Paint is a good name for a horse that still seems like a bit of a work in progress.
I would love to know how this filly got her name. She was content to trail early as the two shorter priced favorites got to know each other on the front end and got a great trip, closing up the rails, switching out in the clear on the turn, really getting in gear late. And her only other dirt race so far was a win on an off track at Horseshoe Indianapolis. She got the setup, and Godolphin and Brad Cox are certainly no strangers to success together.
Yeah, she's got a massive stride on her, a little bit of a paddling action, which some people might be concerned about, but I mean, she really finishes strongly. And like you said, I mean, she didn't have a whole lot of early speed. She just kind of walked out of the starting gate. I mean, she's a little sluggish early in her races, which is something that you probably want to work on down the line when she gets in against tougher competition. You don't want to see horses give away so much at the start of their races. But this was a really nice finish from her. So the races will get tougher as she proceeds down the trail towards the Kentucky Oaks, but she's definitely shown some potential so far in her brief career. And another stakes took place at Oaklawn on Saturday for the sprinters was the King Cotton Stakes, race 8 on their 11 race card there. And we saw a familiar face from last year, Gunite, come back off his 4th place finish in the Breeders' Cup Dirt Mile, turning back to his preferred 6 furlong distance and start off his 4-year-old campaign with a pretty impressive victory.
He seemed like the best horse in the race on paper, and that is exactly how it played out. It was easy to forgive his Breeders' Cup Dirt Mile because he doesn't want to go a mile. Prior to that race, his only other attempt going as far as a mile was the Champagne, and it was also his only off-the-board finish in 12 starts. So cutting back to the 6 furlongs in this spot seemed like a perfect fit for him to kick off his 2022 or 2023 campaign, and he delivered with his second highest career buyer and his 5th triple-digit figure overall.
Yeah, he got a 104 buyer for this performance. And, I talked to Craig a little bit. I saw him saying this on social media that tough figure making day at Oaklawn Park. That's always the case when the track is changing conditions so much during the day and it's continuing to rain. You don't know if the track speed is changing as the track takes on more water. So it can be tough to compare some of these later races to the earlier races. But it did seem like Gunite really ran a fast figure here. Beyer had it a little bit faster than Craig did. I think Craig gave this a 118 TimeformUS speed figure. That number is downgraded a little bit because the pace of this race was pretty slow. Gunite did most of his running in the stretch of this race, coming home that final quarter in, I think, 23 and 2/5 seconds. And I think that just creates a situation where none of the closers could really get into the race. But I do want to mention the runner-up Tejano Twist, who is a pretty neat horse. I mean, he's got a big late run on him. I'd love to see an internal split for the middle quarter mile of this race because he put in a big move around the far turn to go from a clear last all the way up into contesting second place. He just had no chance to catch the winner in the lane.
He did. He really looked like he was rolling and seemed a little bit dangerous for a second, but Gunite was just always in control of much the best in here. But it'll be interesting to see what his next race looks like for Tejano Twist and what kind of pace setup he can get that actually allows him to finish and win one of these.
Yeah, I'm always a sucker for horses like Tejano Twist. They put in those exciting late runs. And as for the winner, Gunite, it sounds like he's going to be off to Saudi Arabia for his next start. I saw them, the connection saying that they plan to go over for, I think it is the Riyadh Sprint. So a big pot over there. And it seems like in the form that he's in right now, why not take a shot? Because Gunite seems like one of the better sprinters in the country right now. We saw another big sprint performance on the East Coast at Aqueduct on Saturday in the Grade 3 Toboggan. And Sarah, I want to be careful talking about this race because I know that there were a lot of feelings being spewed on social media after Repo Rocks won this toboggan. I'll just kind of state the facts. At first, I mean, he clearly, when he crossed the wire, over 8 lengths ahead of his field, and the time flashed up on the board. It was apparent to me that this race was going to get a gigantic speed figure, just kind of being aware of how Aqueduct was playing that day. And the numbers did come in. He got a 111 buyer. Craig gave him a 131 TimeformUS speed figure, and just to put that in context, that's the kind of number that would have put him within a length or two of Flightline in last year's Met Mile. So not sure where it came from for Repo Rocks, but clearly he put forth a huge effort.
Right, and sticking to facts of what we've seen from him in the past, this is a horse that has popped with big efforts from time to time. He's won in several different barns. He's never won 3 races in a row in his 31 career starts. He had never run back-to-back numbers in the 90s. He had never run a triple-digit Beyer. Now here's his 3rd win in a row for this barn. He's run a 96, a 97, and now a career best 111 at this distance. In the past, he was previously 0 for 11 with 3 seconds and 4 thirds. You can't say that he's never run good, solid races or that he fails to show up all the time. That would just be untrue. But anyone that sees this form lately and correlates it with joining this barn and is familiar with how frequently horses do improve significantly at times for this trainer, I mean, to me, this is a performance that is unlike what we have seen in the past.
Yeah, and I think you framed that really well. This is a horse that did have some talent, had actually placed in this race in past years, but we had never seen this kind of effort out of him. The kind of effort that suggested that if he was running in the Breeders' Cup Sprint last year, he would have won it. I don't think anybody really viewed Repo Rocks as that kind of horse before, and he's been in some good barns. I mean, he was with Tom Morley for much of his career. These owners, after they claimed him, they first gave him to Juan Vasquez, who there's been a lot of reporting about, is no longer training horses for whatever that's worth. And now they've given him to Jamie Ness. And I mean, I think it would be wrong to gaslight the fans. And I'll say right off the bat, we know nothing about this performance. And, people will say, well, we want to see, the tests come back and see if they're clean. I mean, that doesn't really mean anything in this day and age. And it's kind of sad to say. I mean, the facts of the matter are, I mean, March 2020, we saw trainers like Jason Service and Jorge Navarro indicted on using performance-enhancing drugs, and, they've since pleaded guilty, going to jail. There's hard evidence that that's what happened, and they had a lot of runners put forth performances that looked a lot like this, and at that time, pre-March 2020, there were a lot of racing fans saying, this doesn't seem legitimate. And I don't think it would be fair to tell those same racing fans that just because a few people went to jail, that suddenly it's a clean sport. I mean, we know that PEDs, performance-enhancing drugs, are all over this sport. And again, we don't know anything about this specific situation with Repo Rocks on Saturday, but it's easy to understand why this kind of improvement out of nowhere and sudden, effort by a horse like this would trigger so many fans and have them talking along those lines. Just given what we've seen from the Jamie Ness barn, off the claim, off trainer switches, it's not the first time we've seen an improvement like this. So I'm just kind of saying, I understand, and I have the same concerns that everybody who's listening to this does. And it's just an unfortunate situation in the sport where, like in track and field and other sports, the drugs are decades ahead of the testing, and there's just going to be that uncertainty when you see a performance like this, us wondering, was it legitimate? And it's an unfortunate situation, and it's really hard to know how to fix.
Right, and I think too, this game is hard enough. And when you and I are trying to analyze races and handicap ahead of time, there are already so many variables. When another one like questions and suspicions come into play, it's already difficult enough to figure out what's going to happen, assuming there is absolutely nothing nefarious at play ever. And as you said, we know that is not the case in general, and neither of us can speak for the specific situation. But I think it's fair when you see something like this that doesn't sit right to have suspicions. And I think that that's all that you and I have to offer about this particular situation. But I think that it's fair to have this be on your mind and think something doesn't quite make sense.
Yeah, and I don't want to go into further detail about this before we say something that we shouldn't say, but just to the listeners out there, I mean, we get it, and we have the same concerns that you do about performances that look like this and the legitimacy of what those sudden improvements that we see in this sport, and we don't know what the answers are. Just like I'm sure a lot of people in the positions that are trying to adjudicate this aren't quite sure how to handle. Well, let's move on to another venue and change the subject, Sarah. We'll move out west to Santa Anita, where they did run a couple more graded stakes on their Saturday and Sunday cards there. The big race on Saturday was the San Pasqual, and Newgrange, a horse who formerly was in the Bob Baffert barn, has now changed trainers, trying to kickstart a 4-year-old campaign, and came forth with one of his good efforts here. This is a horse that I have to say I've never been the biggest fan of. He's just kind of got this way of running that doesn't really give me a lot of confidence that he's going to show up from race to race, but he was able to get it done here.
Yeah, speaking of a horse that's found more success since switching from kind of the Baffert B string to the Phil D'Amato barn, he's never really impressed me either. I think he was finally exposed when he lost the Rebel as a horse that had been beating up on some soft fields at Oaklawn. I looked back. 5 horses have won once each from his Southwest last year, which was a 12-horse field over the course of 62 races. Well, not exactly a key race from there, but his 2 best races were at Santa Anita. The 97 Beyer 2-back put him in the mix, and he showed some early interest, sitting right off of the favorite Hopper in the clear. Seemed like he wasn't really making a dent going into the turn, but Edwin Maldonado didn't give up on asking him, and he engaged.
And I guess it is refreshing, even though he's a former Baffert trainee, it's refreshing to see somebody who's not coming currently from the Bob Baffert barn actually win a graded stakes on the dirt in Southern California, because that seems like it's become so rare these days. But Phil D'Amato did condition Newgrange to get back in form and achieve this victory here over the Bob Baffert trained stablemate Hopper, who was arguably a little overbet at 7-5, but Newgrange did get the job done. Probably not the strongest division of older horses in California that we've ever seen, especially now with Country Grammar and Taba shipping overseas for races like the Saudi Cup and Dubai World Cup. We're probably going to have a little bit of a dip in quality in some of these races over the next few months, but I guess it does give opportunities for horses like Newgrange to get these graded stakes victories. And let's close things out on this podcast with a situation where Bob Baffert did take home all of the top prizes in the Grade 2 San Vicente on Sunday. And apparently, or unfortunately, I should say, this is nothing new, Sarah. It's a real problem in Southern California that all of the good 3-year-olds are concentrated in one stable. We're seeing an even worse example of this come up on Saturday in the Robert B. Lewis, but it's just kind of like a scrimmage among the horses within one barn when you see these races come up with small fields of all Baffert trainees, and having a meltdown was able to get the job done here. He's probably not really in the Derby picture because he looks like more of a sprinter, but he is a runner with some talent.
I don't know how far he wants to go, but he's fast and he's good. He's only lost to Cave Rock so far, who was second in that Breeders' Cup Juvenile. He was the most experienced Bob in the 4-horse Grade 2 with the 3 Bobs. He broke from the rail. He established the early lead. He kept Faustin at bay. It'll be interesting to see if they do try to stretch him out. I don't know that they will. He does seem like more of that sprinting to a miler type, but he's good.
Yeah, and I guess the horse that some people might want out of this race is Faustin, the runner-up. He seems like the kind of horse that is supposed to get better with added distance as a son of Curlin. There was some buzz about him when he closed from off the pace to win his debut, something that we don't always see from the Bob Baffert trainees. They often have a lot of speed in their debut races, so maybe he's one that you might want to keep an eye on going longer, but there's a long way to go between now and the Kentucky Derby. And before I let you go, Sarah, now that we've finished recapping last weekend's races, kind of looking ahead, especially on the Derby trail, is there anything that you're really looking forward to in 2023, or any 3-year-olds that you have your eye on for a race like the Kentucky Derby? Or is it too early and you're the kind that just kind of wants to sit back and watch these performances before developing any opinions?
As a serious serial procrastinator in most things in my life, I do not have a strong Derby or Oaks opinion yet. However, I will say that I'm very excited to see Charge It return on Sunday. He is still the background of my phone from his Kentucky Derby post-parade picture, and just found out yesterday that he will be returning in an allowance race at Gulfstream. So really looking forward to seeing what we get from him, because I think that I want him to be the leader of the older horse division, and I'm very curious to see what kind of performance we get with him returning to the races.
Yeah, it's definitely exciting to see a horse like that back in the entries. That Dwyer performance was absolutely jaw-dropping, and obviously it's a concern that he clearly had some physical issues after that. You want to hope that he's gotten over all of that, but I mean, there is a ton of natural ability there, so it would be great to see him come back with a nice performance at Gulfstream Park on Sunday, and a lot to look forward to this weekend. Got the Robert B. Lewis out at Santa Anita, as I mentioned, but I think 4 graded stakes on that card. We've got the Holy Bull being run on Saturday at Gulfstream Park, along with an interesting 3-year-old allowance race. I've becoming a fan of Tappet Trice, who's running there, so I'd like to see how he does, and also the Withers on Saturday at Aqueduct. So a lot of 3-year-old action coming up this weekend, so we'll be following some of that on this podcast. I'll have another guest on later in the week on Friday to talk about some racing. I think we're going to handicap the Santa Anita card, not the Robert B. Lewis, which is early in the day, but they've got a pretty good late pick 5 sequence there, so I think we'll talk about that on the TimeformUS forecast, which will be coming out on Thursday this week. Sara, I really want to thank you for joining me and taking the time to go over some of these races, and I wish you all the luck with your new endeavor at NYRA.
Thank you. I'm sure I'll be seeing and talking to you more soon, and I really appreciate you having me on.
Definitely, we'll see you around the track. Well, thanks again to Sara for coming on the podcast this week, and thanks to all of you for tuning in. Remember that you can always catch these podcasts on DRF.com, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and YouTube, wherever you get your podcast. Just make sure to subscribe to the Daily Racing Form channel. Again, thanks for tuning in, and make sure to catch that TimeformUS forecast coming up on Thursday.